Now, please welcome to the stage, Lou Paskalis, Senior Vice President of Customer Engagement at Bank of America.
Can you hear me? So I want to start with a story. And the story starts with Madam Prez, Kathy, writing to me. No, it's not bad. Writing to me, I think in November, saying, hey, we'd love to have you back. And, that's a big honor. I don't live here in Boston. I live in New York. My company is headquartered here. My boss is here. So it's always a pleasure to come back and talk to this community. And my team and I started working on a deck on the intersection of being more human and innovation. And we had all these wonderful stories around how tech and data are really allowing us to make these great pieces of content that resonate with the audience. And the thing was good. I found out shortly thereafter that I'd be following Stacey Monero on deck. And if you've ever followed her on a stage, it's the third time I've done it in my career, you're going to lose on slides because she's going to have the most well-produced slides. I don't know if you were watching the numbers in the lower corner of the screen on her presentation, but there was like 162, 247. I think she just makes these things and then, pulls them out, So we were going to compete. We had this great story about innovation and humanity, and something happened. On Monday, I was invited to a friend's home with a bunch of journalists and a bunch of editors and a bunch of people in and around the advertising industry to talk about the state of journalism in America. And it was a real rallying cry. And I was not aware of just how dire the situation is, particularly in some local markets. And I took the work that my team had done, that I had tortured them on, that I was really convinced that we were going to have slides that competed, and I tossed it out Tuesday. And I put together, with a lot of help from my team at Group Connect, the slides you're about to see, which are not pretty. Not their fault, mine. Fortunately, Stacey covered a lot of the Bank of America stuff in the previous slide, so you're not missing out. It's like a twofer, right? I'm going to do something today that I've never done before on a stage, which is talk about journalism and what we can do. I'm going to do a second thing that I really hate to do from a stage, and I'm going to ask your forgiveness. I'm going to read, which I don't like to do. I like to do this. But there's a lot of numbers that I want to share, and I know that I'm the last presentation between you and alcohol, so I'll try not to overburden the conversation. But we are at a crossroads in this country. And the crossroads we're at is really manifest by the state of news. So the news about news isn't so good. And there are things we can do about it. Little things, nothing radical. There is no political agenda here whatsoever. Just as practitioners of the craft of advertising, whether you're on the buy side, the sell side, the agency side, I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the importance of journalism to our business and to the overall economy with which our business rises and falls. So forgive me, here comes the reading. So I think everybody knows that the traditional news industry is in a bit of a decline. Now, interestingly enough, according to Pew, about 70% of Americans say they routinely or somewhat frequently follow news. So that sounds good, right? 70% of Americans, that's a great marketplace. Since 2004, there are 54% less journalists working in America. Since 2004, 1,800 newspapers have folded. Think about that. At the same time, there's a 300% increase in the number of news platforms that are claiming to be in the news business. So, journalists are declining, traditional local sources are declining, yet there's a 300% increase in news platforms. Something is amiss. Just yesterday, Warren Buffett, storied, one of the guys that I followed my whole career, biggest investor in my current company, biggest investor in my last company, probably the biggest investor in my next country. He sold Berkshire Hathaway's news division, which had 30 dailies and almost as many weeklies. Now, fortunately, he sold it to another company that has pledged to continue to keep those entities working. But when Warren Buffett starts moving away from a category, that should get people's attention, right? So let's kind of unpack what's going on here. There are a lot of reasons for it. And in this session I was in at Monday night with a lot of people who are smarter than I am, we talked about the decline of education, and we linked all these things, and eventually it linked all the way to, well, the sun is slowly dying, so we're in trouble. And I kind of said, let's bring it back. Like, what's really happening? So at the core, technology has changed and has enabled consumers to consume news in quotes, in different ways. More than half of millennials now say they get their news from the internet. 62% of adults, according to Pew, say they get their news from social media. Interesting. So when you look at this a little bit more, there's a ubiquity of access. Everyone is now a publisher. I've talked before on this stage about the reality that we are competing as marketers with Aunt Sally and her cat videos. That's my standard quote, right? Well, to Aunt Sally's family, those cat videos are way more relevant than anything we can do. And we have to recognize that. But also is true with news. So you've got journalists producing quality content, and you got other people who are interpreting it. Maybe they have an agenda, maybe they don't. Maybe they're not trained journalists, probably they're not, right? So there are more and more options for receiving news, and 55% of people, according to Reuters, prefer to access news through search engines, social media, or news aggregators, rather than directly from news sources. So, ding, 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 that's rev share, right? All of a sudden, that's more money flowing away from platforms. That's a real problem. There's also news fatigue in our country. I can tell you, probably up until a year ago, if you walked into my apartment any time and a TV was on, it was probably on MSNBC. That may tell you something about me. I'm a news junkie. We're going to talk about those a little later. But people are fatigued now. The news is overwhelming. It's nonstop. Just when you can't be shocked anymore, something shocks you so much more that you forgot the last thing that shocked you. It's the new normal, and it's not really normal. And in this backdrop of this huge proliferation of news platforms, this massive decline in newspapers, this winnowing by half of journalists, advertising revenue flowing to news platforms is down 70% since 2006. Imagine your business being down 70%. Imagine your category being down 70% in 14 years. What would your team look like? What would your company look like? There'd be a lot of what we would call distressed real estate because there'd be a lot of open desks, right? So the result has become a commoditization of news. Anybody can produce news. And a huge decline in quality journalism. And there's been a rebalancing between this sort of journalistic ethos and, well, I just need the information and I'll make my own determination on it. And the ratio of quality, truthful, journalistically derived news compared to the other stuff that may or may not be presented as news is at an all-time low. This means people are less informed about the critical issues that impact them the most. Today, there are 1,300 communities in the United States that have no local news source. They're referred to as news deserts. Think about that. Think about the neighborhood you live in. We all live in big cities, and we have access to multiple sources of news, and we probably have a neighborhood thing and an area paper, and then you have a whole thing for the DMA, excuse me. There are 1,300 communities where there's no local news, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. So The news about news is not so good. Here comes some stats. 67% of Americans say they are concerned about fake news, according to Reuters. By the way, we did all this since Tuesday, so forgive me for not having this memorized, but we got a lot of facts. Almost 8 in 10, roughly 78%, say they have checked the facts in news stories for themselves in order to verify them. That's pretty amazing. Roughly 6 in 10 have stopped gathering news from a particular outlet, and about half, 52%, have changed the way they use social media. Roughly 4 in 10 have lessened their overall news intake. That doesn't sound good, according to Pew. While journalists aren't receiving the blame for this lack of trust, they are seen as one of the only solutions to fix it, according to Pew. Let's face it, journalists are wired to be the knights of truth. Take my word for that. If you've ever spent any time with them, and in my role I have the privilege of talking to them a lot, and I always find time for journalists, these people are wired to get to the truth. Trust matters in our business, and trustworthiness is influenced by everything from individual demographics to political affiliations, experiences, and the same feed with the aggregation and curation bias that we spend a lot of time talking about in an advertising context. Trust is becoming fungible because truth is becoming fungible. And guys, this hits home. This isn't an unfortunate thing over there, because when trust erodes, the digital ecosystem is imperiled. And we now, I think, have a point in time, for a number of reasons, where people have less faith in digital than ever before. Yet, if I were to do a show of hands and say, how many of you are dependent on digital channels for your business, I doubt there would be one hand that didn't go up. At the same time, if I asked, do you think your customers are really comfortable transacting in digital? I think a lot of hands would go down. That's on us. Dollars drive this business. 95% of a social media platform whose name I won't mention, let's call it Lord Voldemort, their revenue is from advertising. 90% of Alphabet's revenue is from advertising. So let's think about that for a minute. We're putting money in those platforms. We don't have a lot of visibility in how that money works. Well, we get some aggregated data, that's nice. But what we're not doing is we're not putting money in places and spaces where news thrives, where publishers are actually getting the benefit of the lion's share of the money. Now, our job is to follow the audience where they go, and if they're sourcing their news from these platforms, yeah, we have to be there. But we also have to think differently, not only about value for our media investments, but also the health of our ecosystem. Trust is at risk. So I was really fortunate as I came home from this thing on Monday night, and I said, you know what? I'm going to do my part. I'm going to stand in front of 500 of the smartest, most talented advertisers in the Boston marketplace, and I'm going to share my thoughts here as unpolished as they are. And I came across an article that came out on Sunday, and I was like, thank you, God. So 4 days ago, Michael Posner published an article in Forbes titled, How Business Leaders Can Help Rescue Dying Local News. And actually, when I found this article, that was the moment I decided I was going to do this, to be honest with you. I'm like, okay, fine. This is real, and there's things that we can do, so let's talk about it. You're very inspired, right? This is fantastic. It's uplifting. It's really, yeah, I'm really excited to be working in the advertising industry. I apologize. This is important. Bear with me a few more minutes. So in this article, Posner confronts the need for newspapers to evolve their business model, which I think is good. He also advocates for the development of a national strategy to save local news, drawing on the private sector, on local businesses, government, philanthropy, and advertisers themselves. It's a short read. It really frames up the issue nicely. It really opens the idea to new economic models, which is what we need to do. Because the value of news, and I'm going to talk about this, and what we pay to be associated with news are nowhere near in balance. And that's existed for a long time. So it's a very sobering read. As I mentioned earlier, there are these 1,300 news deserts across the United States. Alberto Ibargún, I had to spell that out phonetically, Alberto Ibargún, who is the president of the Knight Foundation, and they do a lot of philanthropical work around the press, has highlighted, without revenue, you can't pay reporters. Without reporters, you can't develop consistently reliable news reports about what's happening in your local market. In these news deserts, residents are therefore less likely to stay informed about local issues and have been shown less likely to vote in elections. Local news really matters. Local news is where communities come together, where important social issues happen. Local government is probably the last functioning level of government, because people have a common interest in their community. And yet we're opening the door to less good news and information about what's happening in my marketplace. And that's not good, and we have to find new ways to preserve local news. And with a 54% decline in 15 years, we kind of have to hurry, don't we? So, do marketers have a responsibility to support journalism? This is not going to turn into a civics lecture, I promise you. I am not going to browbeat you about do your job. What I will say is that journalism is the only profession that is called out in the Constitution. It has a role in the checks and balance, the free, independent press. So let's go back to the thrilling days of 1789. Uh-oh, here comes a civics lesson. Sorry. In 1789, there were two kinds of newspapers. There were ad-supported newspapers, and then there were these rhetorical platforms that usually were very left or very right-leaning, very red or very blue, as we would say today. And those obviously were agenda-laden, and the truth in those publications was what was somewhat fungible. It's what led to the Federalist Papers, actually, if you know that story. But when the framers of the Constitution were talking about a free and independent journalism, they weren't talking about those papers. They were talking about the other papers, the papers that had an editor and a publisher who were trying to be truthful and pursue journalistic integrity in a local marketplace. Those papers were ad-supported. The framers of the Constitution, at least implicitly, said that we in this room have some role at least, in supporting journalism. So, do marketers have a responsibility under the Constitution to support journalism? Perhaps. Good luck selling that back at the shop. That's not going to play. Even I wouldn't try that, and I, sometimes I'm Don Quixote on the things that I'll try. But here's what I do know, and we're all experiencing this now, and it's actually good news, so wait for it. It's 15 minutes in, and I got to good news. Brands are going to continue to move toward doing good. Consumers will continue, in a growing way, to challenge the brands they give money to act responsibly, to invest beyond profit margins, and to demonstrate how they can do well by doing good. Business practice, transparency, and the megaphone of social media will continue to challenge brands to take a stance, whether it's gun control or climate change or any of a myriad of issues. I'm proud to say that Bank of America is very active in this space, and we don't always talk about the things that we do from an ESG perspective, and sometimes it frustrates me because we've got great stories there. But I understand why we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to be patting ourselves on the back. I have less of an issue with that, but my bosses are in some different place. So the question I have, though, we're taking on things like recidivism and climate change and gun control. Could journalism be part of our purpose? Is journalism a candidate for your company's or your client's ESG framework? Is it something that really people can rally around? Now, the next sentence of that, I don't know. What I do know is that Google and Facebook, to their credit, have each committed $300 million, I believe that's 1/10 of 1% of their profit, but I'm not good at math, to helping journalism. The Knight Foundation has also committed $300 million over 5 years, which is an enormous commitment for that organization. They're looking at these differentiated economic models. So what's a differentiated economic model? I have no idea. But think about this the next time you're driving on the highway and you see one of those signs that the next 5 miles was sponsored by the Rotary Club. Well, what if the Charlotte Observer was partially underwritten by a major bank? What if your company sponsored the Times-Picayune from New Orleans, or whatever it might be? It's time that we think about models like that. Most of us went to universities where there are endowed chairs, and those chairs are paid for by corporations or wealthy patrons. Maybe companies could endow a reporter. There's something wrong with that statement, but we'll come back to it. And that reporter would be free to do whatever. But here's the thing, folks. We can admire this problem, we can talk about this problem, or we can take action. In 1970, and no, I wasn't working in the business then. Thank you, Jody. I know you thought that. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, a storied Midwestern paper that they use Pulitzer Prizes for paperweights. They've got a lot of them. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had more people writing and editing in the arts and entertainment section than the entire Cleveland Plain Dealer has reporters and editors today. How much longer are they going to hang on? I go to Seattle frequently, and from an apartment I stay at there, you can see the planet from the old Seattle Post-Intelligencer building. It's the only thing left. There's nobody in that building that works there. They just don't want to tear the icon down. So whatever we do, we have to start thinking about it. So let's build the road back. There are opportunities here. Supporting news, and more importantly, the journalists that work in news, is not only good business. It's not only doing good, it may be good for your business. Now let me tell you some of the stuff that we've found. We've done a lot of work in this space, quickly, and we've found that news audiences, this is a cable or broadcast news audience, is 6 times more likely to recall an ad than a similar primetime audience. And of those that recall an ad, they're 5 times more likely to engage with that ad than a similar primetime audience. There's tremendous value there, but more often than not, news audiences are not sold at any premium to entertainment audiences. Huge opportunity there, but you got to do the math. You got to want it. You got to look for it. You got to rationalize it. Now, intuitively, let's think about why this matters, right? So we talk about influencers a lot. Stacy's presentation, she mentioned the word influencer 3 or 4 times. Everybody's got a different definition. Mine does not include the Kardashians. I know that puts me in a very small minority, but I'll bet you all of you are in that same minority too. All right. But I would say news junkies are influencers. I'm a news junkie. MSNBC used to be on all the time. Now it's not. But point being, news junkies have a say in what the folks around them think, do, feel. 20 years ago, Ed Keller and Brad Fay wrote a book called The Influencers. It predated the internet, it predated social media, and it was all about that 1 in 10 people that actually are the sort of person in the neighborhood or this person in the social circle who really influences others because they know they're connected. So here's some interesting info from MRI. Self-described news junkies are 10% less likely to consult others for advice on purchase decisions, 25% less likely to consider the opinions of family members when making decisions. News junkies are far more digitally savvy and more connected online and typically make decisions on their own. These are hard to reach folks. These are people who are like, yeah, I'm going to figure it out on my own. So they're influential, and they like to figure things out on their own, but you can reach them in news because that's where they spend all their time. 60% of news junkies say they are outspoken. I would say, armchair research, I would agree with that. And 30% of us say that we frequently post our opinions online. If anybody follows me on Twitter, it's LOUPAS, by the way. I'm pretty outspoken online. Kathy knows that. So, news junkies are 15% more likely to say they follow the latest trends and fashions, according to MRI, and 71% of news junkies say they frequently find themselves in leadership roles. So here's an audience of people who influence others, who keep up on trends, who are sold at a discount relative to other impressions, and we're in a situation where 1 in 3 marketers today are suppressing the entire news category. Don't go near news. It's too provocative. That's like saying, don't dig the gold out of the mine because there's too many rocks. Not necessarily the right strategy. What you've got to do is want it. What you've got to do is say, you know what? There's a lot of value in this audience, and we're going to figure out a way to stay within our governance framework, to stay within our risk tolerance, to avoid those provocative things that could have a detrimental impact on our brand, but still reach the news audience that's valuable. So one of the things that I would recommend is when you go back to your offices tomorrow, assuming Friday's a work day in Boston, it doesn't seem to be in New York anymore. I work on a floor with global HR in my company, and I swear to God, they're on a 4-day work week. I'm like, this is great, there's nobody here. But no, like, ask yourselves, are we suppressing the entire news category? Did we just say we'll be back in 2021? Also too late? Think about whether or not that comports with your company's overall voice in the marketplace, your company's purpose, the ethos of your company. You're walking away from journalists. You're walking away from these knights of truth at the very time they're in a war to defend truth because it's a little inconvenient to dig the gold out of the mine. We can do better. We can definitely do better. So, your role in this. I think it's possible to advertise in news. I think you can mitigate the risk of controversial topics. I'm very fortunate to work for a company that when we came up with the idea to say that we needed a head of brand safety, they said, go create that role. And today we have 3 people working full-time in that role, and we're able to use that resource and say, okay, let's figure out a pathway forward on news. Let's figure out how we can continue. And we actually did that before I walked into this thing on Monday night because we recognized that there was value there. And I'm very proud to say that we have been averaging about 30% of our entire digital spend today in news environments. Now, it's not easy. You've got to really work hard. Another thing that you absolutely have to avoid, and I would ask you to go back and at least consider this tomorrow when you're at the office, are you using single keyword suppressions in news? Does your single keyword suppression list include impeachment, Trump, Pelosi, Congress, election? Have you watched any news lately? Do you understand what you're doing when you're using those single keywords? It might be a story about Donald Trump planted flowers yesterday. That's a great story. I'd want to advertise in that, right? So we moved to more complex strings of words to help filter in programmatic. So we avoided the salacious, the inflammatory content, and we focused on the opportunity to really connect with the news audience in more in more appropriate, brand suitable environments. And this has helped us out a lot too. A plug for brand safety. I got a call 2 Sundays ago from my head of brand safety who was reading an article about how Samsung and L'Oreal had discovered that some of their content was running on a platform next to climate denier content. And it was one of those situations where we immediately kind of did our rapid response thing and pulled together our team and said on a Sunday, okay, do we have the right filters and guidelines in place to make sure that the vendor community knows this is outside of the bounds of what we want? And it's a really wonderful and flexible apparatus. And so I would also suggest, as part of this exercise, to consider how you litigate brand safety inside your company, and are you giving your agency team or you as a client giving your clients principles, filters, guidelines. Every company will come to a different set of those. But you won't come to them if you're not talking about those things, and if you're not having meaningful dialogue, and if you're not being transparent with your management. And I really recommend that in this era because I think we're sailing into an era where we're going to have more headwind around truth and fake news and finding an audience in a suitable environment than ever before. So think about that brand safety team, and maybe as a first exercise, put them on news and help them relitigate what you're doing in a news space and think about how you might be able to invest more in that space. So, little reminder here. We do a lot of very tactical blocking and tackling to be able to deliver that 30 cents out of every dollar that we spend in digital. It starts with a great ad verification partner. We use DoubleVerify to identify custom content categories and how we're ingesting advertising into them and dynamically learn where the boundaries are. We're constantly reviewing our principles. We're constantly adding new guidelines. We're constantly doing training around the bank and with all of our partners to make sure we're incredibly transparent about what is and is out of bounds. We're working not just with DSPs, we're working with SSPs, because there's a lot of issues there on fraud, and some of the adjacency things don't come through in a taxonomic layer. You got to work through that. It's not easy. You got to want it. We're working with publishers to understand reader sentiment. The New York Times has got an unparalleled product in that space. That also helps us understand, like, hey, we didn't realize this was an inflammatory topic, or maybe we thought this was an inflammatory topic and it turns out it's not. Again, it's not easy, but you can find your way through this as long as you have a few solid principles and a good working transparency with your management, and they understand the importance of what we're doing. We talked a little bit about stringing keywords together for better context matching. All of these things, I think, are easily done in the next couple of weeks. Let's stop blocking news as a category. Let's take on the programmatic suppression of single keywords. Let's go talk to a publisher of a local newspaper in our marketplace. Every one of us has a headquarters somewhere. I'm fortunate we have 3, all in the same time zone. Very convenient. Go talk to that publisher. Say, hey, how can we work differently together? Are you open to new economic models? What do you need from us? If every one of us did that with one local paper in one local market and found one way to help prop them up, what that would mean for the trajectory of journalism. And look, I'm using newspapers as a broad local concept. We all know that at least 30, if not 60% of their revenue is coming from the digital arm of their platform. In some cases, they don't print anymore. They're 100% digital. That's fine, too. They have journalistic integrity. They employ journalists. We need to move money to the people who employ the journalists, not to people who make the money off the backs of journalism, and hand 50 cents back on a dollar. It takes a little bit of work, but it's worth it. So, in closing, a free press needs you, every one of us, and we can't wait. And I would ask you to do one thing on this topic tomorrow. I don't care what it is. Call your friend and say, there's this crazy guy from Bank of America on a stage who gave me a lecture right before cocktails about how we should be doing more with newspapers. Doesn't he know they're dead? Okay, at least you talked about it. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I made an impression. So review your policies in advertising and news. Are you avoiding news altogether because it's too toxic? Does that reflect your company's values? Are you leaving money on the table by doing that, given the relative value of news audiences? 6 times more likely to recall your ad, 5 times more likely to engage with your ad if they recall it. Create a governance routine and consider how news can be supported. Work with your digital team to understand how news environments are currently suppressed. Avoid single keyword suppression. We can do better. Engage your brand safety team, or create one, to identify ways to monitor news content and find suitable adjacencies. Stop conflating facts with opinions. There's more the news industry can do, too. We didn't talk about this in the interest of time, but I will say one of the challenges we have is that certain cable news platforms, you don't know if the next sentence is going to be a fact or an opinion. When I started in this business, there was an editorial page, which was the most expensive place to advertise in the New York Times. You paid a premium to be there, but you also knew you were sailing into a risky environment. You didn't know what the topic was going to be or where they'd come down on it, but you knew it was an engaged audience. And you could avoid that with a feature section or the international news or whatever. Well, in broadcast news now, that's all gotten mushed together, and you've got talking heads, and you don't really have safe spaces if you want to avoid opinion. So talk to that publisher, talk to that local news outlet, whoever it might be, and say, hey, can we create 15 minutes out of every hour, which is, is not opinion but is fact? Whatever it might be, whatever your brand safety conclusions are, start merchandising that back so the publishing community has strong signal from the advertising community of what would work. All they're getting is a drip, drip, drip off the programmatic machine. That's not actually using our marketplace leverage. Our marketplace leverage is, I could do more with you if you could help me find safe ways to deliver my message. I think a lot of us have entrusted team members, and we've outsourced that a little bit, and we've deprioritized it because we've got a million other fires. This is a fire worth fighting. This is a country worth saving. So take time to talk to some local publishers I mentioned, and just get engaged. Have conversations. Have conversations with peers in the industry like I did on Monday night and had my eyes opened at just how pernicious this problem is and how immediate the call for action is. I will leave you with this quote. America relies on truth. Journalists are the knights of that truth. Their trusty steed is a free and independent press. Advertising revenue is their sword and shield. Let's not send journalists into the battle for the war on truth unarmed. Thank you.